Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Oh, is it glitching again? Well, there we go. Okay, we're good now. I think I figured this out. I might be stupid. I figured it out. I'm good. This is the Washington Presidency in 1 hour. Why are you always doing stuff about George Washington, Chris? Because I like George Washington. I apologize. I find him very fascinating. Yes, he was a slave owner. I get it. No, I'm not glossing over that as though it's not important. It's disgusting. It's terrible to own another human being. I understand that. But there are things that I look at that I do not hold someone accountable. It was legal. I don't judge him by today's laws, morals, or standards. I don't do that with anyone. You got to hold them accountable to their time. Hold them to that time because they don't have the luxury of living in our standards today. George Washington could grow up today and say that he's a chick. We have no idea. But I can't say that he would. So I can't hold him to today's standards. I'm also doing this because, let me exit out of this bad boy. See, it's 2/21/25. See George Washington. Why, Chris? Because tomorrow would be George Washington's birthday. He would be a very young 293 years old. So, I am going to do this video. It'll be 3 parts. 23 minutes. 23 minutes, Chris. Do some math. It'll be about 23 minutes each part. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into it.
The man.
Before I do that, I should also say this came out 4 months ago. Okay, it's the American Story, U.S. History documentaries. There's a lot of videos on this channel I really do like, so I did subscribe. That's why I'm pointing this out. Thumbs up if you could do that for me, helps out tremendously. And then you can donate to the channel through the thanks button. If you donate, request a video, your name sponsors that video. Okay, back to the video.
Known to history as George Washington, was born on the 22nd of February 1732 at his father's plantation of Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County in the colony of Virginia, one of the 13 British colonies in North America. His father was Augustine Washington, a member of Virginia's landed gentry and a successful businessman who owned several tobacco plantations as well as iron operations in Virginia and neighboring Maryland, in partnership with the English Principio Company. He was also active in the local militia and was a justice of the peace and sheriff for Westmoreland County. Augustine had married his first wife, Jane Butler, in 1715, who bore him.
Okay, sorry.
4 children before her death in 1729. A couple of years later, in 1731, he would marry the 23-year-old Mary Johnson Ball, who would give him a further 6 children, of whom George was the eldest. Mary Washington was born in 1708 to an elderly father who died 3 years later, leaving her 400 acres of land, while her mother died when she was 12. The orphaned Mary was left in the care of family friend George Eskridge, who was probably responsible for introducing her to Augustine Washington. Thus, when Mary gave birth to her first son, she named him George. Brought up as a loyal subject of the British Empire, as a child, George Washington could never imagine that one day he would be responsible for leading the successful military rebellion to break free from Britain and establish the United States of America. He grew up in eastern Virginia amidst a vast expanse of farmland with plantation houses and small towns dotted across the landscape. Within the British social hierarchy, the Washingtons were considered commoners, far removed from the regal splendor of the court of King George II. Nevertheless, within the American colonies, the Washingtons were by no means poor, and with over 10,000 acres of plantation land, together with his other commercial interests, Augustine Washington was certainly a member of the local elite. His wealth and prosperity depended in part on slave labor, allowing plantation owners a lot of free time, which was typically filled with fox hunts, horse races, and other entertainments. Augustine Washington's tendency to move around his properties to better manage his business interests meant that George had an unsettled childhood. In 1735, the family moved to the 2,500-acre estate of Little Hunting Creek on the banks of the Potomac River, and 3 years later, in 1738, they moved once again to Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River across from the port of Fredericksburg, and a short ride away from the ironworks at Accokeek Creek. From his house, George could see the ships being loaded with tobacco, iron, and other commodities, which would soon fuel the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, and in return, the colony of Virginia grew steadily richer. One of the most important figures in George's childhood was his half-brother Lawrence. 14 years older than George, Lawrence studied at Appleby Grammar School, where he stayed on as a teacher until the age of 20. It was around this time, when George was 6 years old, that the two brothers first met. He heard stories of Lawrence's service as a captain in a Virginia company in 1739 during the War of Jenkins' Ear against Spain, named after the British naval captain whose ear had been cut off during an altercation with the Spanish several years earlier. Lawrence was part of an expeditionary force led by Admiral Edward Vernon, which attacked the Spanish port of Cartagena in South America. The effort proved a bloody failure as the force was cut down by the enemy and yellow fever. Captain Washington never made it off the ship, blaming General Thomas Wentworth, who treated the American soldiers with disdain and did not even let them leave their ships. In spite of this, Lawrence Washington proudly served the British Army as a commissioned officer and was appointed Adjutant General of Virginia, with responsibility over the organization of the colony's militia companies. When his father transferred him to the management of the estate at Little Hunting Creek, he renamed it Mount Vernon after the admiral. George may have expected to receive the same classical education as his elder half-brothers, but such hopes were extinguished on the 12th of April 1743 when his father died at the age of 49. The 11-year-old George's share of his father's inheritance was Ferry Farm, but his mother Mary continued to run the estate and would continue to do so as George reached adulthood. Mary's strict upbringing of her 5 surviving children meant that the relationship between mother and son was cool and distant, with George addressing her in formal terms in his letters as "Honored Madam." He looked forward to his trips to visit Lawrence at Mount Vernon.
If you want to know about the relationship with his mother, during the American Revolutionary War, she used to send him letters basically upset with him that he was off fighting this little insignificant war and not spending enough time with his mother. That little insignificant war, the Revolutionary War, fighting for a country. And she's like, "You're not spending enough time with your mother." So, and they were talking about that farm. He was supposed to take it over, I think, at 18. And she was like, "Yeah, no. I'm just going to go ahead and keep running this." Which is why he ends up, I don't want to spoil it, but it's why he ends up getting into Mount Vernon
as an escape from his overbearing mother. Details of George Washington's early education are sketchy, and any instruction he received was likely rather basic. The available evidence suggests that he had lessons in basic mathematics and picked up knowledge of business and economics of his own accord. As a teenager, he would read widely in history and philosophy, as well as the popular fiction of the time. He also enjoyed physical activity and outdoor pursuits.
He was a big fan of Shakespeare as well.
Swimming in the Rappahannock, and proved to be an excellent horseback rider, an attribute that would serve him well in his military career. Later in life, Washington regretted not having the opportunity to study French, Latin, and Greek. the signs of social and intellectual distinction of the day. Among his better educated friends and colleagues such as John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, who provided the theoretical and intellectual foundations of the United States of America, Washington's intellect seemed backward and provincial. In his own terms, however, he was an intelligent man who could translate ideas into action. After losing his father, Washington came to rely even more heavily on his brother Lawrence, who had not only been elected to the House of Burgesses, but had married Anne Fairfax, whose family owned more than 5 million acres, managed by her father, Colonel William Fairfax, on behalf of his English cousin, the 6th Baron Fairfax. The young George Washington befriended Anne's brother, George William Fairfax, who was 8 years his senior, and also won the affection of her father, the Colonel. In 1746, the elder Fairfax and Lawrence planned to help George escape the clutches of his mother by joining the Royal Navy. Unwilling to lose a useful helping hand on the farm, Mary eventually vetoed the plan. Thwarted in his ambitions to go to sea, at the age of 15, George decided to become a surveyor, a lucrative profession as settlers continued to expand westwards. This training allowed him to appreciate geographical features on maps and in the real world, a skill which he would use throughout his professional life. His first job in the spring of 1748 was to help the Fairfaxes divide up their vast domains into plots for further development. Within a couple of years, he would make his first investments in land, buying up over 2,000 acres by the time he turned 20. George would add to his land holdings in 1752 following the death of Lawrence from tuberculosis that July at the age of 34, leaving behind his wife and a baby daughter. Lawrence stipulated that in the event of their deaths, his estate of Mount Vernon would pass on to George. The death of his brother dealt a heavy blow to George, who had
All right, sorry about that. I'm cooking dinner at the same time.
hoped to emulate Lawrence's military career. After lobbying the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, he was appointed Adjutant General of his home district in February 1753 with the rank of Major. Major Washington would soon be a very busy man. By 1753, both the British and French empires owned large tracts of land in North America. The 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern coast, bounded by the Allegheny Mountains to the west, while the French territories ran from New Orleans in the southwest through the Mississippi to the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River in the north. As both empires expanded their footprint, they soon had competing claims on the vast Ohio country. In 1752, the French began building several forts in the disputed territory, and the following year, Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie, a leading investor in the Ohio Company, received permission from London to build a set of British forts alongside instructions to inform the French to leave the area. The 21-year-old Washington was chosen for this special mission and set off with a small company and crossed the Alleghenies in November 1753. Washington executed his task diligently, not only carrying out his diplomatic duties, but gathering intelligence on the terrain and the strength of the French and Native American presence in the area. Upon his return to the colonial capital of Williamsburg in January 1754, his journal was adapted into a report for the council and was passed on to London, where it informed British military preparations to defend the Ohio country against the French. Washington secured for himself a major role in these military preparations, leading a small militia force who would march to the forks of the Ohio River and construct a fort. At the same time, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, though he was disappointed that as a colonial officer, his salary was much lower than those of regular officers in the British Army who had royal commissions. In early April, Washington set out with 160 men into the wilderness, only to learn that a force of 1,000 Frenchmen had captured the fort the British were building at the Forks and renamed it Fort Duquesne after the Governor-General of French Canada. Washington and his Native American allies called for reinforcements and made camp. On the 28th of May, 1754, Washington and his company found a small group of French soldiers encamped in a secluded position. Believing them to be up to no good, Washington's men surrounded them, and a quick firefight resulted in a French surrender.
I like how this is the Washington presidency in 1 hour, but we've not discussed his presidency. Is this this was the start of the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War. And I never get it right. Is this the Battle of Jumerville Glen? Is that the name of it? Jumerville?
During the skirmish, a French officer delivering a diplomatic message asking the British to evacuate the Ohio County was supposedly brutally killed by one of Washington's Native American allies. The act sparked an international incident, and while Washington was applauded in the colonies for being a hero, the authorities in London considered his behavior reckless and further evidence that colonial soldiers could not be trusted. Anticipating a French response, Washington hastily constructed a wooden fort named Fort Necessity. During these preparations, his commanding officer had died after falling off his horse, and Washington took command of the Virginia Regiment as colonel. When he disregarded his Native American allies' advice to withdraw on account of the inadequate defenses provided by the fort, they deserted him and left the British to fight alone. When the French and their Native American allies attacked on the 3rd of July, Washington put up a brave fight, but lost a third of his men and was forced to surrender. It was a humiliating defeat, and he had made many mistakes owing to his lack of experience, but he learned from it the effectiveness of the enemy's mobile tactics and
He also realized that he built a Fort Necessity in a terrible area. It was basically nothing but woods all around, and he picked a clearing to build the fort. And you could stand on the, I'm back. You could stand up in the woods and shoot down over the top of the fort and get people like, oh, if this is the fort and you're up here, you could shoot down and kill people that were on this side looking out. It wasn't a very good location. That's why the natives were like, nah, we're out.
Futility of defending poor positions. The defeat could have ended Washington's military career before it started, but instead, after a few weeks had passed, he and his men were praised for their brave last stand against the odds. While the Virginia Regiment was disbanded, leaving Washington without a command, his personal fortunes improved when his late brother Lawrence's daughter died at the end of December. As Anne had already remarried, Washington agreed to lease the estate of Mount Vernon from his sister-in-law and made it his main residence. Not long after he moved into Mount Vernon, Washington received news in February 1755 that General Edward Braddock had landed with 2 regiments of reinforcements from Britain. Washington rushed to offer his services, and Braddock was happy to have him as aide-de-camp. Leaving his younger brother Jack in charge of Mount Vernon, Washington joined Braddock in June. And
if you've never been to Mount Vernon, this is an actual view of the Potomac from the backyard. It's beautiful, beautiful location. And so many times, that's Maryland over there. So many times companies will build something. They'll want to build something, and they'll want to put up, insert company, and wants to build something that would protrude out of the woods, out of the forest here. And people at Mount Vernon will get protests going and sign protests. I've actually signed some of them too. I don't really know what's going on, but they always say, hey, look, don't let this ruin the skyline of Mount Vernon. And you'd be amazed. A lot of companies will not buy the property with the protest because they don't want to offend. And so they will just buy a location that's, out of view or in a different area because their business doesn't need to be here, but they're very polite about it. And Mount Vernon will always ask the guests, and they'll put out emails. Hey, look, sign this petition that we just don't want it. Obviously, they can't stop it, but the companies have always been very gracious and said, okay, so they won't do it. They won't put anything that would obstruct the skyline where maybe you have some kind of a tower here or something like that. And I'm talking. Yeah, I always thought that was very respectful.
The army made its slow progress towards Fort Duquesne. Although personally warm towards Washington, Braddock held the same disdain for colonial soldiers as many of his fellow officers in the regular army. And
that is, this is, I believe, in Williamsburg. This is the courthouse. And right out here is where they would put the prisoners. I think across the street from here, if I remember, this is where, like, the white people would go. You'd be shackled. But across the street is where the black people were hung or hanged. Apologies.
Refused to heed his aide-de-camp's advice to travel lightly, before eventually giving in to the situation to pick up the glacial pace of the advance. On the 9th of July, Braddock approached Fort Duquesne with more than 2,000 men and divided his army into 3 columns to attack. The British were surprised by the ferocious defense of 900 French and Native Americans, whose tactics once again proved superior. Washington.
Their tactics, let me say that again. Their tactics were to hide along the trees and shoot down, while the British tried to form a line firing into the woods while they were like on a path and there was just trees all around. So they were trying to fight the European style against natives and the French who had learned how to fight alongside the natives, where it's like, hey, look, here's a tree. I'm just going to stand behind this tree. They're all going to fire and hit the tree, or it's going to whiz past me, and I'm going to pop out and just fire a shot and then hide again and reload. The British learned pretty quickly in this fight that just doesn't work. And Washington was just all over Braddock. You can't fight this way. You cannot fight this way. Braddock was like, they're gonna run when they see the power of the British military. The natives don't know the British military. The French did, sure, but the natives didn't know, nor did they care. That's not how they fought. You were just standing in a line ready to be picked off. It was a terrible way to fight.
Bravely carried out Braddock's orders to rally the troops, exposing himself to great danger with 2 horses shot from underneath him. This was not enough to bring victory, and Braddock himself was mortally wounded. Following Braddock's death, the Virginia Regiment was reformed, and Washington was appointed commander of all of Virginia's forces. Despite these rapid promotions, Washington remained unhappy about not receiving a royal commission. He resented London's strategy to pursue active operations in Canada while remaining on the defensive on the frontiers of Virginia, leaving him nothing to do but to train and drill his men. He was dismayed by the state of the militiamen under his responsibility, many of whom deserted en masse. In late 1757, he was struck down by a grave illness that prompted him to return to Mount Vernon. During this time, he would begin to make changes to the estate and create a house fit for an English country gentleman. In early 1758, after a brief courtship, he was engaged to Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy 26-year-old widow whose husband had died the previous summer, leaving her with 2 young children. A warm and sociable woman, Martha was the polar opposite of her mother-in-law Mary, and proved a steadfast support in her husband's life and career, capable not only of carrying out the domestic duties of a housewife, but also of running the Mount Vernon estate in her husband's absence. In July 1758, Washington returned to action as the British made a further attempt to seize Fort Duquesne and avenge the loss of Braddock, this time serving under the Scottish General John Forbes. In the meantime, he entered political office for the first time by handsomely winning election to the Virginia House of Burgesses representing Frederick County, a reflection of his reputation as a war hero. Despite some disagreements with his superior and a devastating friendly fire incident which claimed the lives of more than 20 of his men, Washington led 2,500 men and successfully recaptured Fort Duquesne in November 1758. Instead of the ferocious defense he had met on previous occasions, he encountered no resistance at all, as the French chose to abandon and destroy the fort after falling out with their Native American allies.
Fort Duquesne is on present-day downtown Pittsburgh, for anyone who doesn't know. Hold. Images. Let's see. Where's my tum-tum? No, I don't need that. There you go. No, I thought I paused it. Apparently I did not. So here you go. Fort Duquesne's right there. Well, that's the monument, but Fort Duquesne was like around this area. So there you go. All right, make sure we are still running. Okay, back to the video. That's the button.
The British rebuilt it and named it Fort Pitt, after War Minister William Pitt, while the city that was built around it would take the name of Pittsburgh in the state of Pennsylvania. The action would be Washington's last in the French and Indian War, better known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, where the fighting between Britain and France, supported by their respective allies, would last until 1763. Washington returned to Mount Vernon and married Martha on the 6th of January 1759, making him one of Virginia's richest landowners. In their efforts to emulate the upper class in England, importing the latest fashions from London, Washington became increasingly indebted to his London agents and resented their power over the colonial planters. At the same time, he carried out his civic duties in the House of Burgesses, serving on committees related to military matters and limiting any speeches to the most important points of the debate. For the next 2 decades of his life, Washington would devote his energies to his plantation, in particular to growing tobacco. This proved a poor economic decision, and one Washington would later regret, as the quality of the tobacco crop was highly dependent on weather conditions, while international market prices were volatile. These factors contributed to Washington's struggles repaying his debts to his creditors in London. Another key aspect of tobacco farming was its labor intensiveness and dependence on slavery. During his life, Washington owned over 600 slaves. He and his fellow planters treated slaves as any other type of property to be bought and sold, although over time he grew to despise the practice and treated his slaves more humanely than most of his peers, looking after their.
But let's also remember, he owned slaves. You know, he may have treated them great, but unless he was buying them and freeing them, he still owned slaves. I get it. Yes, I get it. I understand.
Health and eventually refusing to sell any of his slaves in order to keep families together. The French and Indian War ended in 1763 in a decisive victory for the British in North America. France had lost Canada to Britain and Louisiana to Spain. The cost to the British Treasury had been enormous, and half the national budget went on interest repayments on government debt. In an effort to fill the hole in government coffers, Parliament attempted to impose taxes and other economic costs onto the North American colonies, preventing the existing colonies from further westward expansion. As a soldier, Washington had resented the superior attitude of the British authorities and their refusal to give him a royal commission. As a businessman, Washington now had cause to consider the decisions of the British authorities to be detrimental to his economic interests.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. I'm got to check dinner.
The most infamous piece of legislation passed by Parliament was the Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a tax on all printed material, including legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards. Washington may not have been the most radical of the voices protesting against the Stamp Act on the political stage, but he considered the tax unconstitutional and wrote to his representatives in London that the colonies would begin to boycott British goods in favour of domestic substitutes, and courts would shut down, preventing British creditors from collecting their dues from their American debtors. At around the same time, and perhaps concerned about his dependency on British credit, Washington decided to diversify away from tobacco, eventually abandoning the crop altogether in favour of wheat, corn, hemp, and dozens of other crops. Mount Vernon also had an extensive fishing enterprise from the plentiful stocks on the Potomac, initially for consumption within the house and later salted and cured for export to international markets. The diversification away.
I don't remember exactly what it... Hey, are we done? Thank you. I don't remember exactly what the number was, but like he used to, well, not he, the slaves used to catch fish, like mackerel and stuff like that. And it was something ridiculous, like over 1 million fish a day or a week a day. You know what? Let me check. Pause. Okay. So it says George Washington's fishery in the Potomac River caught hundreds of thousands of fish each spring. This includes shad, herring, striped bass, catfish, perch, crabs, oysters, and clams. Now, somewhere I read that he caught 1 point some million. That could have been a really good year, though. But don't quote me on that, apparently. And then I also saw Washington's fishery. But let's get back to that video.
Away from the labor-intensive tobacco crop encouraged Washington to train his surplus slaves in a number of crafts, such as carpentry, bricklaying, smithing, and baking.
That's what I was going to say. He also would, when the slaves would catch fish, if they had an abundance of fish, he would buy the extra, and that would just go to the house. It's nice instead of just taking it, but it's nice. But they didn't have to sell it to him. But, you know, if they went out and they fished on their own and they caught a ton, they could sell them some extra.
Although Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, it continued to assert the right to taxation in the colonies, prompting sustained opposition, which spread throughout the 13 colonies. In 1767, the Townshend Acts, named after the British Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, levied duties on paint, lead, glass, paper, and tea. During the winter of 1768 to 69, Washington's attitude became more radical, and he supported a boycott of British goods. While he did not rule out armed insurrection against what he considered a sustained attack on American liberties, he believed that non-violent economic measures should be used first. In April 1769, Washington took a more proactive role in the House of Burgesses, intending to present a plan for the importation of British goods developed alongside his friend George Mason of Fairfax County. The following month, the Assembly voted in favour of a set of resolves which asserted that the House of Burgesses had the sole right to tax Virginians. In response, the royal governor, Lord Beaucourt, dissolved the body, forcing the Burgesses to reconvene in a tavern, where they debated and adopted Washington's proposals to boycott the goods subject to taxation under the Townshend Acts. The move had some effect, prompting the new British government under Lord North to repeal the Townshend Acts, keeping only the levies on tea to continue asserting Parliament's right to taxation. The situation had temporarily been diffused, but the remaining taxes on tea provoked the Boston Tea Party on the 16th of December 1773, when a group of men from the American patriot organization Sons of Liberty boarded a merchant ship belonging to the East India Company and dumped its valuable cargo of tea into Boston Harbor.
Okay, we're going to pause it there. Boston Tea Party. What's going to happen next? We have no idea. Don't spoil this, all right? No spoilers. All right. Well, this is part 1. I'm going to end it here. We will be back with part 2, but not tonight because I'm going to go eat. So until next time, have a good day, have a good night.